Hello and welcome back to our second webinar in our webinar series on implementing a response to intervention model for English language learners. This webinar is on understanding assessment types, analyzing assessment types. This is Sky Marietta narrating today, and I'm presenting materials developed with my colleagues at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Noni Lasso and Emily Phillips Galloway. What we're presenting today was developed in collaboration with the Office of English Language Learners at the New York City Department of Education. Today's webinar has a few goals associated with it. As with all the other webinars in this series, we have a turnkey presentation designed for you to present with schools and school personnel. And today's turnkey presentation is about understanding assessment types in an RTI system and working to determine if the schools are using their current assessments appropriately. So our primary focus today is on matching type with function. We want to understand the types of assessments that are in place and if the function they have in our school is a best match for RTI. In the data competencies that we've been working to develop, we are going to focus as always on leadership, on understanding the people in place on the ground and helping to lead them. We're also going to turn our attention to in this webinar to design. So we're thinking about the design of a nice RTI assessment system. What sorts of assessments would that have in place? And we're going to do this through a process where we would create buy-in and lead people towards this type of RTI model. Some of the common pitfalls that schools face in developing this type of assessment system that fits well into an RTI model are using formative assessments for accountability or screening purposes. Formative assessments really give us information on how students are performing relative to their peers. Wonderful assessments, really rich information for teachers to design instruction. However, because they're designed to give us information on how students perform in a supported context, working one-on-one with the teacher in sort of school-like task, they don't necessarily tell us how students are going to perform when they're out there in the big bad world and other settings without that kind of support or when they're presented other kinds of text or task. The way that we really see this is we have some students who are performing on grade level in the classroom, but when they are faced with a state standardized assessment, their performance does not give that same level of proficiency that the teacher has thus far assumed. So the problem becomes that when these types of assessments are removed from their classroom use, removed from the purpose of informing instructional planning, and used to try to look at a building level how our students are performing by instructional leaders. The moment we take those tests away from the classroom, they start to lose a lot of meaning. They certainly can't serve a screening purpose because they don't tell us how students are performing relative to state or national standards. We need something specific for that, something that's been carefully calibrated psychometrically to give us that type of information. Whenever we start using these formative assessments for screening or accountability purposes, we tend to have some misses with some of the students who are at risk. Another drawback of this approach is time spent on assessment. So using lengthy one-on-one formative assessments with all of our student population at set times throughout the year is a very time-intensive prospect. One-on-one assessments that take 20 or 30 minutes more with each child might be really useful in terms of understanding that child's reading performance, but we really need some information that's much more on screening. That is a very time-intensive way of going about, something that really we could get very quickly in a few minutes per child, or perhaps we close the door and administer one test to the whole class, something that shouldn't take away too much time from instruction. Different type of process from mandating that very lengthy assessments be used periodically throughout the year. Another problem that we see schools face is getting very focused on item types from a standardized test. So an example that we use frequently because we see it in practice so frequently is we get the state test results, we pour over them, and we notice that our students did not score well on main idea. So the temptation, that's very logical, is to try to teach main idea. Okay, now let's do a unit on main idea. And we're going to have students identify the main idea passages over and over and over again. The analogy that we use in this situation is a lot like a basketball tournament. So we think about the team who lost a basketball tournament, and we're going to go back and look at the videos. What the analogous basketball skill to main idea might be is dunking the basketball. So now we see that, you know what, our team didn't perform very well at the tournament, we lost the game, and you know what, our students do not have good dunking skills. So now we're going to do dunking drills, and we're going to have our students dunk over and over and over again. But imagine what that would do with a team where the team members lacked some fundamental physical fitness skills. So they were having a hard time even moving up and down the court. Now we're having them work on a skill, dunking, that requires the coordination of a whole lot of other skills that sort of assumes that a child can run and jump and dribble. Working only on that end goal and not the underlying skills. Very similar to trying to teach main idea. Main idea is something that comes from the coordination of a whole slew of literacy skills. It's a very end product piece of having a lot of very strong literacy skills in place. Focusing on isolated end product skills, usually not very helpful unless we're pretty certain that all those underlying skills are very strong. We're not going to beef up a lot of physical fitness by practicing dunking, right? Similarly, we aren't going to be building a whole lot of vocabulary skills, a whole lot of comprehension skills, and even some of our persistence with text if we're focusing over and over again on just identifying the main idea. Finally, we see schools investing increasingly in a type of assessment that we call test prep. These are generally assessments that were designed to mimic a state test. Generally, the test developers sort of promise some predictive power. They say, oh, we'll be able to predict how your student will perform on a state test based on this very similar type of assessment. But once again, these are not going to uncover our instructional needs. If once again we see that students are having a hard time on particular item types, these types of assessments don't let us know where the breakdowns occurred. Was it because they don't have a broad and deep enough vocabulary? Was it because they weren't reading quickly or accurately enough? Was it because the student was struggling to decode? We don't know. We just know that they got the answer wrong. For that reason alone, not very useful in an RTI model. But in general, we have this big caveat with test prep assessments where generally they're calibrated to a shifting target. So what happens is every year states release their old test. So what the test prep company does is it takes a test from a few years ago that's now been published or released by the state and retrofits based on that old test a new set of items that will reflect the same outcomes that that one would. Well, as we know, state tests change from year to year. So there's no way to guarantee that going through a series of exercises designed to mimic the 2010 state test, for example, is going to help our students when they take the test this year. So it's a little bit of a risky proposition and not necessarily the best way to go about promoting the kind of reading achievement, kind of literacy skills that will ultimately result in better scores on a state test. So let's talk about the actual presentation that you will present to schools on analyzing assessments. In our RTI implementation progression, where we're focused today is on examining the assessment system. So within this piece of the progression, our focus today is on analyzing our current assessment pattern to determine what types of assessments we're currently using and what is the alignment between the type of assessment we're using and its function in an RTI model. To achieve these goals, we're going to go through a process in this webinar. The first step of this process is to understand assessment types, then to categorize the assessments within a school's battery. So now that we understand the types, we're going to think back about the tests that we use at our school or in our district and bucket these. What kinds of assessments are we using? What types are we using? And finally, we're going to pay some attention to the alignment between the type and its function. So we're going to think about the types we have, how those types were designed to function, and how we're using them. Do we have a match? We have some guiding principles today for talking about assessments. First of all, there's no good or bad assessments. We're not saying that one assessment or one assessment type is better than the other. There are, however, good and bad ways of interpreting and using assessments. So where we get into trouble isn't necessarily that we have an inherently flawed assessment, but that we're trying to use the assessment in a way that it wasn't intended or designed. So this is a mismatch between its use and its type. These assessments should fit into an RTI system that promotes student reading development, supports instructional decision-making, and minimizes time spent on testing. So we don't want to get so caught up in having certain specific assessments that we aren't paying attention to how well they fit into our system and how well they're matching our particular needs to support the instruction of our students. Last piece of this we'll focus on again in the next webinar, but really is about time on testing, right? Any time spent on testing is time that could be spent on instruction. So we want to make sure we're reducing the time we spend on assessment in favor of time on instruction. We have this nice quote by T.J. Marchese, who's an NCAA athlete, a football player, who says, "Assessment per se guarantees nothing by way of improvement. No more than a thermometer cures a fever." Really important guiding principle for us today. Nothing wonderful about data in and of itself necessarily. What we really want to do is get data for a particular purpose. We want to get data to improve the reading of our students. So let's take a moment to reorient ourselves towards our goals for our students as readers. This is something that participants discussed in Webinar 0, and it's worth spending a little bit of time revisiting how we think about using instruction to help our students explore new ideas, to convey ideas precisely, to use new words, and to use print as a tool in a lifelong journey of learning that will, in the long run, promote access to greater citizenship, health, economic, and educational opportunities. We want print to be a vehicle towards a better life for our students. And ultimately, our assessment battery needs to support these goals. Not assessment for assessment's sake, but assessment that's going to give us some really nice information that we can use to improve instruction so that we can improve our students' lives. First piece of this puzzle is understanding our assessments. So in our progression, we're on step 1. And our focus for today is really on our Tier 1 assessment system. We know that RTI is a multi-tiered system and that there'll be assessments at all of these different tiers. What we want to think about today are what are the assessments we have in place for our entire school population that informs instructional planning and supports students' learning. Within a Tier 1 assessment system, there are 4 common assessment types: formative assessments, screening assessments, outcome assessments, and what we call test prep assessments. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about each of these assessment types. Formative assessments are tied to the curriculum and daily instruction. Same kinds of behaviors and activities that a child would do to participate in a formative assessment that they would probably do regularly in regular day-to-day classroom type of instruction or behaviors. This type of assessment is largely driven by teacher observation, so usually a teacher observing a child performing reading or literacy task, although they can be formal as well as informal. Formative is a really large bucket of assessments. So some of our common formal examples includes things like the Developmental Reading Assessment, or the DRA, the Fountas and Pinnell Benchmark Assessment System, but also formative assessments include some of these regular parts of good teaching that our teachers use frequently, like check-ins at the end of a class day, something like an exit slip. It might include journals. It might include quizzes. It might include a workshop or a conference where you're talking with students about things that they understand. That is also a very important type of formative data. Screening measures, in contrast, are quick assessments that provide a reference point for student performance outside of the curriculum in specific separable skills. So the nice corollary in health would be a thermometer. We're taking someone's temperature really quickly. We have this external set point. We know what's a fever and what's not a fever. There's this set benchmark created through careful calibration that tells us Yes, no, okay, not okay. We often talk about this as a quick red light, green light, yellow light. So some common examples we see in place are the DIBELS, really quick one-on-one assessment, the STAR assessment, the Gates-McGinnity reading comprehension test. Our outcome assessments are the normative assessments given once or twice a year. These assessments are mandated by states as outlined in No Child Left Behind Act. So the example in New York would be the New York State ELA test. Pretty much mandated in every state, if you work in a public school, that you're going to be administering an outcome assessment once a child's in about the 3rd grade. This final bucket called test prep is something that is new, relatively new. Publishers responding to market demands. Test prep assessments are assessments that mimic state assessments to provide a sense of how students will perform on that end of the year test. So again, the way that these tend to work is TestMaker takes an old version of the test that was been released by the state. They use it to create some new items, do a little bit of testing, and say, well, we can predict how your students will do because we've mimicked the item types on an old standardized test. So some examples include Acuity and the Acuity Information Exam, although there's now others as well. So if we're thinking about these 4 assessment types, they fall on a continuum of how aligned they are with day-to-day instruction. So our formative assessments are the most closely linked to day-to-day assessment, to day-to-day instruction and how we're going to plan instructional delivery. If I'm the teacher and I've been teaching a particular skill and then I'm observing my student to see if he or she can use that skill, I'm getting some really nice real-time information that might change whether or not I reinforce the skill tomorrow or teach it in another way. Really closely linked. Our screening assessments are not quite as closely linked. They give us just a quick sense of our students on target or not. That's going to shift our instructional priorities, but once we get the result, it's not necessarily going to tell us how to teach it. So an example I often use is the example of a strep test. We have a child, they go in, we take a strep test. If we do in fact find out that that child has strep, we don't treat the strep by giving them another throat swab. What we need to do is put the strep test away and figure out, well, what is the best choices for treating strep? Do we need antibiotics? Do we need a fever reducer? Should the child be taking more fluids? We're going to take a multi-pronged approach. But the best pedagogy, the best approach to treating something is pretty removed generally from the type of assessment. Important to keep in mind because some types of screening assessments can feel uncomfortable because the procedure is not the way that we would teach children. And that makes sense because to have these psychometrically valid properties that they do have, they often involve the kind of behaviors or tasks that we wouldn't normally see in the classroom setting. Just fine in this case because we aren't really using it to design instruction. We're just using it to signal an instructional need. Then our outcome assessments are even more removed from day-to-day instruction. We sometimes spend a lot of time analyzing the assessment types or the item types on the test to see what we should teach, but generally it's not that useful. What we find is a much better way to use outcome assessments is to get a general sense of how are we doing with the different populations of our school, where might we generally direct some more energy, but the more we start to think about specific students or specific item types, we tend to be led astray in a way that isn't really informing instruction. Now, test prep is a category that we would say is actually completely removed from instruction. And in fact, we would say that test prep should not be part of an RTI model. Why is this? It's because it doesn't tell us about students' instructional needs in a way that we can respond. So by mimicking these item types, we're not actually finding out about underlying skills, even in the most broad sense, that our students need support in. So we do not think of test prep as being part of an RTI model. So to further support your participants' understanding of these test types, what we're going to do now, or what we suggest that you do now, is hand out this handout on assessment types you see an example of to the right of our screen. So you would distribute the handout and allow the participants some time to read. And this is probably a good time for them to debrief about these 4 assessment types. What questions do they have? Anything that comes up? Anything that seems unclear? And this handout is going to be a resource for the rest of the session for the day. So this will be a reference for them. They can go back, and anytime they're feeling uncertain, wait, what kind of assessment was this? Can it do? What can it not do? They can go back to this handout and use that as they're going through some of the group work. So our goal in thinking about these assessment types is how they function in an RTI system. And what we want is for a really nice alignment between the assessment type and its function. So let's think about categorizing the assessment types that we have at a school. And our progression, this will be step 2. So here we have a handout entirely available for the participants in the workshop to write on, fill out, and spend a little bit of time analyzing their assessment battery. So the first piece that our participants are going to do is to write out a list of each assessment used at the school. Just go down the list, boom, 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 here's what we use at each grade level. And the second piece will be to use the assessment types handout as a guide to decide which of the measures are formative, progress monitoring, outcome, or test prep. So for each assessment, we're going to check a box and say, this is the type of assessment we think of this as being. For right now, we're going to wait on columns 3 and 4. Those can wait until a little bit later in the session. Now we're going to take some time to think about the assessment type and its function in an RTI model. Once participants have had a little bit of time to inventory their assessments and check off what type of assessment each one is. And the process, this is our third and final step. So in thinking about the alignment of type to function, so for each type of assessment, let's think about how it's used appropriately. So for formative data, if we're thinking about how it's best used by the teacher versus the instructional leader. For the teacher, it's to check for understanding as part of day-to-day planning. It's to form and rearrange instructional groups. We want really flexible instructional grouping. This is something that can really help us adjust our groups in real time. And it's also data that helps us drive lesson planning because we're constantly engaging student learning. For the instructional leader, formative data is not quite as useful because it's very close to the teacher observation. However, as an instructional leader, formative data can be used to enrich discussions of pedagogy. So you can imagine a really rich discussion around student work in which we're doing further investigative work to think, well, what does the student know and not know? And what are the best next steps for teaching the student or teaching this classroom? Really great discussions to have. However, we should be really careful that formative data is not used to screen for difficulties. In fact, the New York State DOE, among other bodies, says that these should not be used for screening purposes. The reason is that the way that these are scored doesn't necessarily tell us about performance relative to state or national standards. Because this type of data is central to the work of teachers, we recommend that it not be collected or aggregated as a school. We don't necessarily want to see the principal or assistant principal or instructional leaders sitting there poring over a list of scores on formative data. Again, very subjective, very teacher-driven, and in fact, when formative assessments are used for accountability purposes, we see their really wonderful use in supporting instruction can oftentimes get lost. So teachers get worried about the results. They are thinking about improving the results rather than using them as a guidepost and planning really good instruction. Suddenly, getting scores on the formative assessment becomes the end result. It becomes something that they're very nervous about and can actually take away from their real purpose. So what are the hallmarks of good implementation for formative assessments? In the school, we'd want to see teachers administer these on their own timetable as needed to inform instruction. So we wouldn't want to see a school mandate that teachers administer formative assessments, say 2 or 3 or 4 times a year. Instead, it should be the kind of assessment that a teacher decides, either, when I want to initially form my reading group, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a DRA with my entire class. Or let's say that I have this student and I just don't think I fully understand what's going on with him in terms of his reading group. I'm going to pull out that F&P benchmark kit, spend an hour with this child going through the full kit and getting a much deeper understanding of him as a reader. Now, this suggestion definitely brings up some reactions, which makes sense because many times people are concerned, well, if it's not required for teachers to administer formative assessments on this timetable, they won't administer them at all. So this becomes a concern, which is understandable because in a best practice scenario, if we're thinking about best practices for instruction, we would of course constantly be using data to improve our instruction. What we need to keep in mind is that typically formative data takes a great big deal of time to administer. And if a teacher is unwilling to administer the assessment, chances are not very high that making her administer the assessment will somehow result in a deep analysis of the results that will inform instructional planning. And if it's not going to inform instructional planning, it's probably not the best use of time. We'd much rather see a school mandate screening assessments, so at least we have some relative sense of how those students in the classroom are doing. So as an instructional leader, you have some sense of the supports that are needed. When the teacher's administering this at their own timetable, what we see is the scores stay at the individual level. So we're focusing on students, we're focusing on classrooms. They're not really being aggregated because we understand that it's understanding each child in context. It doesn't necessarily give us a lot of information about how the child would perform in another context. In the classroom, we really want to see this data used to better understand students' needs. We really want to see it used for instructional purposes. If it's not feeding directly into instruction, probably not the best use of time. Now let's think about screening assessments. For teachers, the use of screening measures is to understand student performance relative to state or national standards. We oftentimes have a sense of who our really strong readers are, but especially when we've been working in high-risk settings for a number of years, it's pretty easy to lose track of what is really good for our classroom versus what might be considered really good in the country at large. What is considered proficient in our classroom may or may not match up, in fact, with what is established proficiency across the country. The other nice thing about screening assessments is it lets us start to see patterns across our students. So we can identify patterns of instructional needs in the classroom, which can let us be a little bit more efficient, especially in classrooms where we have a lot of high-risk kids. We might not have enough time to develop an individual plan for every child in every way. Perhaps that would be the ideal scenario, but when we've got a classroom of 20, 25, 30 students, chances are we don't have the time. When we see the patterns in our classroom, we can start to differentiate for our particular classroom community, deliver much more tailored instruction, and use the data for that purposes. This will let us identify priority areas for our Tier 1 instruction. So if we see lots of students, for example, struggling with vocabulary, we realize, wow, this is a big need in my classroom. Let me really think about how I'm teaching that. Can I punch that up? Can I intensify that? Do I need other resources to help me teach vocabulary better? Also, screeners allow us to have profiles of student risk. So what we start to see is, okay, we have students who are red light, yellow light, green light. They're doing fine. They're not doing fine. They're at risk. And also in particular domains of literacy. So we start to see right away some groups, who needs help, who doesn't need help, some of this really quick pass information that lets us think about our classroom of students in a much more systematic manner. For our instructional leader, our screening data is used to identify patterns of student performance. So we can see across a school, are there particular areas of need? Are there particular areas of need that emerge over time? Are there particular student populations who are needing support? And some of these patterns allow us to allocate our resources most efficiently. It also allows us to see priority areas for professional development. If overall we've got a lot of students struggling in a particular area, we're usually better off to build teacher knowledge than to, say, bring in an add-on program. Teachers tend to do better with whatever materials they have on hand if they have more knowledge about that. Also lets us make sure that we have a timely and appropriate model of service delivery. Who are our at-risk students? What are we doing for them? Are we getting that in place very quickly? Does it match their needs? Screening assessments help us get that right at the building level. It also helps to have some information about our curriculums and our programs. So if we have a curriculum in place and we see lots of needs of our students across time, we might think, is this best meeting this? Is there a hole in here? Is there another piece? Are the supplemental programs we're providing actually meeting the needs that have been demonstrated by the data? Of course, we do have the caveat for this that lots of research suggests that the actual specific curriculum or program you use is a lot less critical for student performance than the teacher knowledge. So we would generally recommend that we focus on professional development first and then think about the curriculum. But you might find as you're thinking about your programs and evaluating them for fit, we can use our screening data to get a much better sense of how well they work with the school. Of course, these screeners identify potential problems. They don't tell us the best course of treatment. Back to that analogy about strep throat or any other type of sickness. We know a child has a fever, we don't necessarily know why, and we don't necessarily know the best course of treatment. We just know there is a problem. So we want to be really clear that we step away from the assessment once we have the results and start thinking about really good pedagogy. Hallmarks of good implementation for screeners. This is where we want to see a school-wide schedule with a timeline for administration and scoring, particularly at the very beginning of the year. We want to get those students in, we want to get them screened, we want to know who needs additional help and who is doing just fine. It's also very nice to have a vertical alignment of the test across grades. It promotes a lot of dialogue between grade levels and also allows us to follow students over time. So we can see if over time students are performing better, if they're growing at good rates, or if over time we're not seeing the kind of growth that we'd like. It's a little bit hard to get that information if we're not administering the same test over several years. In the classroom, our screening data is used as a quick green light, yellow light, red light to identify needs for more intensive instruction. Again, not how to design the instruction, but who needs more intensive support. In an RTI model, we start thinking about this. Our screening assessments are what are going to identify students who need tier 2, another tier supplemental instruction. And again, the patterns in the data across students can drive our instructional priorities. If I have 90 minutes in my literacy block, let me think as hard as I can about how I'm using those 90 minutes. Some of my data from my screening assessments will inform that approach. Our outcome assessments. For the teacher, something like the New York State test tells us how students are doing compared to the outside world. So we get this sense in something called English Language Arts, are students getting it or not? And that's about as much as it tells us for instructional purposes. We can get a lot of deep information for instruction from an outcome assessment. It's sort of this far-off goal to move towards. Our instructional leaders, it helps us identify broad areas of strength and weakness and gauge how well our student is serving groups of students, so student populations. So with the state test, we can see how our students in special education are faring, how our students with limited English proficiency are faring, how our students who qualify for free reduced price brunch are faring, and different racial subgroups. We get this information about equity, very much more removed from instruction from what we've seen previously. And what we know is outcome measures should not be used to drive instruction because the items do not correspond to the underlying skills. It's like playing a basketball tournament. We don't know exactly why, from an outcome assessment, the breakdowns occurred. We need data that's much closer to the students to get a sense of that and to design the corresponding instruction. Good implementation. In the school, we want to see our outcome assessments used as a broad indicator of how groups are performing against expectations for the school-age population. Are they there? Are they not? Are they hitting the target? Or are they not? And in the classroom, we might think about results inspiring some inquiry into potential student needs. Lots of students having a hard time on the state test. We're not going to ignore that. We're just not going to spend time poring over the item test types to design some sort of intervention. Instead, we're going to say, let's try to figure out where these breakdowns occur. Hopefully our screening data gives us some of that information, but we're always constantly thinking about students with formative data, with every piece of data that we can get. Finally, let's talk about our test prep measures. So what role do test prep have? Don't tell us about underlying skills. They don't help us design instruction. What is the appropriate use? So if your one concern about your students is that they just don't know how to fill in bubbles or sharpen a number 2 pencil or sit there for that kind of assessment, or they might be completely unfamiliar with the way that the test is administered and the directions. It might provide some test preparation and practice for students. Of course, there are diminishing returns over time. So if you're doing this, you might find that after an hour or so, you're not getting a whole lot of extra improvements. And for the instructional leader, similarly, you might see that test prep provides an option for test prep for students and teachers to prepare for that day, just in terms of the behaviors, not in terms of building up the skills or knowledge needed to perform well. Again, test prep is not part of an RTI assessment model, so we don't want to see it used in any way with RTI. We won't actually talk about it in the rest of the series, but we do want to tell people about it so that they can make informed decisions. So, good implementation with test prep, really to be used sparingly to provide familiarity with the process of taking a standardized test. I guess at the school level, this would be to make sure that we're not devoting way too much time across the year to just practicing standardized assessments, not going to build up the knowledge and skills needed to perform on game day. So let's take a moment to talk about this more, because test prep assessments are really common, and I wouldn't be surprised if you got pushback from people saying, well, why can't we use test prep as a screener? It tells us who's going to do well or not well on the state test. So really, there's two reasons why we can't use test prep assessments in a screening type of role. First of all is what they measure. So the items on test prep assessments measure outcomes and composite skills, like dunking the basketball, and they don't provide the information on the teachable skills underlying performance. If you have a student who's having a hard time uncovering the main idea, there could be so many reasons behind that. We don't know from the item type. We just know that they got it wrong. And what we're going to need to do to help them get there are lots of other pieces. Probably practicing finding the main idea will not be this key piece that will make it fall into place. It will probably be reading widely to have a broader background knowledge or more content knowledge about particular topics. It might be reading more just so you have more practice and you're able to be more persistent when you read, or have a wider, deeper vocabulary, or so that you read more quickly so you have enough cognitive space left over to make sense of what you're reading. It will not be going through any sort of passage and just circling or underlining to say this is the main idea. You might get a small bump with some students, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to help you get your students where they want to go, and it certainly is not going to give them greater access or improved lives. The other piece behind that is how they're developed. So we want to push on this again, that test prep assessments are calibrated to the latest released version of the test. Excuse me. However, state tests constantly change, and it's unclear if matching results to last year's test will inform performance in the upcoming year. So now that we've talked about these 4 assessment types, and we've identified the 3 that are part of our RTI model, let's take one moment to take the big picture. In a strong assessment system, we would have formative measures. There'd be a lot of little moments throughout the year where we'd be doing formative measures. They'd be ongoing as needed to calibrate instruction. We'd also have some screening measures in place, and these would be our periodic check-ins on student mastery against external benchmarks. You'll notice what we did here was we break apart code-based measures and meaning-based measures. Something we're going to talk about a lot more in subsequent sessions, but the long and short of it is we want to be following children not only as they develop word reading skills, that begins very basically with their ability to identify letters and match the letters with letter sounds and read quickly and efficiently. We also want to, from the very first days of school, think about their meaning-based skills. Vocabulary, background knowledge, oral language skills. We want to be following those 2 in tandem. Particularly important, of course, for our English language learners. And of course, in any context, we're going to have these outcome assessments, these annual summative assessment of student achievement in broad content areas like English language arts. Those usually begin in 3rd grade. Formative measures, best practices, we see the timing dictated by the teacher. For our screening, the timing would be dictated by the school. And we know the State Department of Education is going to tell us exactly when we're supposed to administer the outcome assessment. So this is sort of the big picture of how these 3 different assessment types fit in together to create our Tier 1 assessment system. And now that we've had a time to think about each one of these in turn and how these fit together, what we're going to do next with our participants is return back to thinking about our types and how do they function in our particular system, back to our analysis. So what we're going to do now is thinking about the assessment types in the current battery. What we're going to do is think about, well, we've named the assessments, we've said the type they are. Now let's think about how is it being used. So we're going to go back to that same worksheet, and this time we're going to check off how is the assessment being used. While our participants are doing this, we're going to encourage them to take any notes they'd like to take on the alignment between the type of assessment and its function. So if they notice any misalignments, if there's anything they're curious about, they can go ahead and take notes for debrief. Now let's discuss what we found. So we suggest these discussion questions to have with participants. How can we better match the type to function and how we administer and use assessments? What information are we missing on our students? Do we have some types of assessments and not others? It's a very common scenario. Very common scenario that we see in a lot of urban schools is lots and lots of formative data, lots and lots of test prep data. We certainly are going to have outcome data on students who are at least in 3rd or 4th grade, but very rarely do we have these screening assessments in place. We want to give participants some time to digest and to respond to this information. Our last piece in this is closing and reflection are some of the takeaways. So the summary and takeaway from today are that scores on literacy assessments tell us about students' instructional needs. And in order to fully understand students' needs, we've got to use screening as well as formative assessments. We have to have some sort of measure that will give us that external proficiency compared to anybody else in the state or in the country. In order to have an efficient RTI system, we need to make sure that we're carefully matching each assessment type to its function. So we want to use our formative assessments as needed to design instruction, and we want to use our screening measures quick. That's what we mandate across the school to understand who's at risk and not. Otherwise, we're going to be spending a whole lot of time on assessment. And this takes us to the end of our webinar number 1.